Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to our third Thursday Drupal for Gov's webinar. Our title for today in our presentation is A Guide to an— Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to our third Thursday. Sorry about that. I am live streaming and I left the tab open. Our title for today is A Guide to an Accessible Heading Hierarchy, and our speaker today is Michaela Liederman from A10 Design Group. So before I hand over the reins to Michaela, I'd like to cover some items. Most of you are aware of Drupal for Gov and all of the training that we provide, but for those who don't, we are a community of open source advocates, and we love all things open source. In addition to this webinar that we hold every third Thursday at 3 p.m., we also have our yearly conference, which is our biggest conference or event of the year or that we hold. And this year it will be August 13th through the 15th. So mark that on your calendar, and I hope you can attend. We also do global training days and half training days, and we participate in the Gov Summit at DrupalCon North America. If you're interested in presenting for a webinar, you have any questions, please reach out to us at drupalforgov@gmail.com. We're also available on LinkedIn as well as Slack. So check us out and reach out if you have any questions. I have to give a big shout out to our June webinar sponsor, which is Mobomo. If you're interested in knowing more about their agency, check them out at www.mobomo.com. Drupal for Gov also likes to share other Drupal events happening within the United States and outside. So if you somehow live in Bulgaria, there is a conference June 26th through the 28th. There's also a conference in Asheville, North Carolina, July 12th through the 14th, and Drupal Camp, Colorado, which is being held July 25th through the 26th. Information and important dates related to Drupal GovCon. Registration has not started yet. Tickets will be available beginning July 1st. And if you're also interested in training, which is provided on the days of the conference, that sign up begins July 19th. So make sure you're receiving emails and are on the email list so that you can receive more information about that. We are always looking for places to host our events and our half days. So if you work for an organization or agency that has the space, please reach out to us. We would like to talk to you and possibly do a half day or another event. If you miss a session, please, you can check it out on YouTube. We are currently live streaming this session now. And I'm excited to introduce Michaela Liederman. She writes and speaks about accessibility and does accessibility trainings and is certified as an IAAP Web Accessibility Specialist. Thank you, Michaela. Also, one last thing, if you have any questions, please leave them in our chat and it's easier to moderate from there.
Awesome. Well, I hope everyone is excited to learn a little bit about accessible heading hierarchy. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. And I just want to confirm that everyone can see my first slide, a guide to implementing an accessible heading hierarchy. I hope so. Good. I saw a couple of thumbs up in there. Well, welcome everyone to a guide to implementing an accessible heading hierarchy. My name is Michaela Liederman, and I am the Senior Accessibility and QA Lead at A10 Design Group. I am a certified web accessibility specialist through the International Association of Accessibility Professionals. A10 Design Group is a full-service digital agency. We've been around for more than 24 years and can handle everything from your next website redesign to ongoing support and everything in between. We provide digital strategy, design, and open source development for mission-driven organizations around the world. We work with many government sector clients like the City of Boulder and the City of Oxnard, as well as a number of other amazing higher education and nonprofit organizations. We are passionate about partnering with organizations to tell their important story and doing work that matters. And with that, let's jump in. Oh, my thing is slightly frozen. There we go. So let's jump into implementing an accessible heading hierarchy. So we'll be talking about a few things today. So we're going to ask ourselves, what do we actually mean when I say heading hierarchy? Why is a correct heading hierarchy important? How to write accessible content with a hierarchy in mind, as well as how to work with a hierarchy in a component-first approach. And then, of course, if there is time, which I'm pretty sure there will be, I am happy to take any questions, or if you have something on your site that you are looking to clean up from a hierarchy standpoint, feel free. That's something we can definitely share in the chat. And especially if there's time, we can maybe dive into some of those questions and kind of see that in real time. Some of this presentation may be a bit beginner focused at first, but I do want to make sure that we are all on the same page from beginning to end. So let's dive in and ask the bare minimum question for today. What do I mean when I say heading hierarchy? Well, when I talk about a heading hierarchy, I mean it's the use of HTML heading tags to communicate the organization of the content on the page, both visually and programmatically. And this is super important to understand that we are communicating organization visually, of course, but I am mentioning the programmatic, the semantic side. If you learn anything today, it's that hierarchy needs to be programmatic first and foremost, and not just a focus on the visual side and making it look like we're following a correct hierarchy. Things that are important are bigger, things that are less important are smaller, and so on. So what exactly is it? Well, HTML defines 6 levels of headings: heading 1, heading 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6, with H1 being the highest or the most important level, and H6 being the lowest or least important. So if I'm looking at a quick screenshot of some code here, it's just HTML code, I can see that we have an H1 element, and then inside of that is the heading level 1 and then the closing bracket. And you can see we have that for each level heading here. So we'll say heading level 2, but it's all within the H2, H3, H4, H5, and so on. And from a visual side, if you are using Drupal, you're most likely using CK Editor, and there should be an area where you can actually highlight some text, and then you can choose what heading level you want it to be from, like this example here. Using heading tags applies all native default font styles to help visually. This includes things like font size, font style, paragraph breaks before and after, and any and all white space necessary to render the heading. So all that I'm saying is that if you have no CSS applied and you just use this H1, H2 and do this correctly, you will get a default hierarchy. So we can see here that the H1 is the largest. H6 is much smaller. Visually, we can kind of see that the importance of each level and where it lives and how things are nested within other elements there. And of course, it's important because you can style this however you want, but this is just to show you that the visual hierarchy is a default when it's using correct semantics. And finally, web browsers, plugins, and assistive technologies can use them to provide in-page navigation and an outline or structure of the page, to understand the content of the page and to easily jump around the page using shortcuts, similar to how if we're visually looking at the page, we can easily see headings that are subheadings of other ones that are nested within other. Just visually, we can see that. So for those that don't know, people who are using assistive technology should be able to do that as well with this correct heading structure. So I have a quick example here where I have the code at the top here and using correct semantics. We have heading 1s, 2s, paragraphs, and so on. And then the visual side below it. Again, no styling is added. We're just using default styling here. And you can see automatically that the heading elements is nice and large. It's going to be the most prominent one on the page because it's the first heading. It's the H1. Then we can look quickly to see what the heading 2s are. I can quickly see that summary, examples, and see also are now the heading 2s. But now I want to dive in deeper, and I can see that there are multiple head examples within that example heading. So we're kind of diving in a little bit more from there. And visually we can do that, but we do want to make sure we can do that easily from the semantic and programmatic side as well. Next, it's important to remember that we always follow the correct heading structure in order programmatically. We never use a different heading element just to change the size or the look of the text. The heading element is for context only, not for looks. CSS and styling is for the visual aspect. We never want to skip heading levels. Heading 2s should only ever be found after an H1. Heading 3s should only be subheadings within an H2. H4s should only be found nested within an H3, and so on. I have this example here. I'm not sure why I went with this example about beetles. It's not really my usual jam, but I do think that this is a great way to display what we're looking at. So I have it in a way that you can see the nested portions. So we can see that the H2s are nested within the H1. The H3s are indented even more, so they're nested within the H2, and so on. It gives that visual cue of how that nesting actually works. And it's important to remember too, let's say we decided to get rid of the heading 2 external morphology because visually on the page, it just didn't make sense to include it because we had like larger headings for head, thorax, legs, and wings. But without that heading 2, now those elements are within a whole different topic. So it becomes a little bit more confusing for a user who may just be listening to the content on the page rather than what they're actually seeing. And most importantly, bolded paragraphs should never be used as a heading. And yes, let me repeat that because it is the most important thing I want to convey to everyone because I see this all the time in content. Bolded paragraphs should never be used as a heading. As I mentioned before, a proper heading hierarchy is both visual and programmatic. Paragraphs are programmatically, well, they're paragraphs, they're not headings. You can make them look like a heading using CSS, but they are not contextually a heading. If they were, they'd be headings, not paragraphs. And as we will learn, this will also hurt your SEO, but more importantly, it can be detrimental for those who require assistive technology like screen readers because they're not found within that heading element to be able to navigate to. So let's break down these heading elements a little bit more. H1 tags are used as the most important text, such as the title of the page. H2 and H3 tags are commonly used as subheadings. H4, 5, and 6 tags may be used to provide further structure within subsections. However, these tend to be rarely used. So let's actually think about this as if we're thinking about the structure of a book. Don't mind me if I use this analogy throughout the whole presentation, but this is where I felt like it made the most sense. So let's think we have a book in our hand and the H1 is the title of the book. So this is the page that we're looking at, but this is the title of the book. And there tends to only be one story in a book. And I know that there are books of short stories. I'm not talking about those outliers. I'm talking about the majority of books out there. It is a simple book with one title. Next are H2s. They're the chapters within a book. So they're the main headings on the page, the important breakpoints that we want within that page or within that book. H2s can live on their own since every page already has that H1. It's the book title or the page title. There doesn't need to be any higher level headings to worry about since an H2 always just needs to be nested within an H1. Therefore, these tend to be the most common headings, especially in components. H3s are subheadings within a chapter or subheadings on a page. So you may not think like, oh, this doesn't happen too often in books, but there's a book that I was reading. I can't remember what it was. I've been reading a lot of books lately, but one of them, it was like broken up by the person whose point of view we're at. So like the H1 is the name of the book. The H2 is Michaela. And then the H3s within that, or the subsections, were like morning, afternoon, and evening. So it kind of broke up the day to give a little bit more context. And that same thing would be happening with an H3. It wouldn't make sense to have morning, afternoon, and evening if you didn't know who you were following at that point in that book. H3s cannot live on their own since they always need to follow an H2. Otherwise, it will look like it's a part of the current chapter that you're on and not a separate chapter, or the current heading or section of the page that you're on and not a new section. And H4s, 5s, and 6s are pretty uncommonly found in books, and it's pretty similar in websites as well. They're not used very often. If you find you are using a lot of heading 5s or a lot of heading 6s especially, then you definitely need to rework your content and confirm that you are using the correct hierarchy on the page. So why is heading hierarchy important? Well, in general, semantic HTML should always be implemented because of general best practice. No content should ever just be within an empty div or an empty span because it doesn't convey any context for search engines, browsers, or assistive technology. All content should be wrapped in a heading or a paragraph or a link or a list or just any element that conveys important contextual information to a user. So let's take a look at a couple of reasons why. So proper heading structure shows an outline of the page. It ensures that users can understand the content without reading everything on the page. It becomes an easy way to view the page, almost like a table of contents. A lot of times this is just visually how we scan a page. We want to find the information we're looking for. And if we're using headings correctly, we're able to dive in and see what we're looking there. Because they make your page more user-friendly by making your content more readable and accessible, this ensures that users will come back again and again to get that information quickly. So it's important because readability or scannability of content for visual users. And as mentioned, correct heading structure helps with the scannability of the page visually. Users can leverage size, color, and other visual cues to associate hierarchy to content rankings. So I have a quickly scrolling page here, and even just looking at this quickly, I can easily spot the heading twos on the page visually. I can see exactly, okay, I want to how to get financial aid. I can dive in from there and see what I'm looking at. I'm looking for forms of the financial aid. Oh, we need student employment or how to get financial aid. I can now see that there's how to apply and things of that sort. I don't need a lot, but I can easily see what I'm looking for on the page. Even though there's a lot of content, it's visually broken up in a way that makes it just easy to scan and get to the information that you're looking for quickly. Next, we want to, is because readability or scannability of content for screen reader users are important. Screen reader users have the ability to navigate a page similar to how we do this visually. Users can navigate and look for just links on the page. They could just list out and just look for heading 2s or just heading 3s, just lists, and so on. So as you can imagine, a proper heading structure creates a very great experience for screen reader users as they now have a proper outline to work from. Skipping headings or not using headings at all can cause a really terrible experience. Similar to how you probably don't want to read an entire page just to find one small piece of information you were looking for with no headings, it's just long bits of text. A screen reader user doesn't want to listen to a large page of text to find one small piece of information, like a needle in a haystack. Remember that screen reader users are about a quarter of your possible users, so we want to make sure that everyone has a good experience on your site. I did think about including a video of a screen reader today, but because you're already learning something new, sometimes adding a screen reader in there can be a little overwhelming, especially for those who have never heard a screen reader before. So I decided to take a screenshot of the visual piece that you can be seeing while you're listening to a screen reader as well. So this is just looking at all the headings on the page. And as we can see, or if we were listening, as we would hear it, you could easily jump around and look for, okay, I'm looking for heading 2s, and you can see there's available forms of financial aid, how to get financial aid staff, contact info, and so on. And then within each one of those, you can see there's a list of H3s. So it's an easy way for someone to be able to look for just the heading 2s on the page. They're listening for them. And then once they find the heading 2 they want, they now listen to the heading 3s within that section so they can easily get the information they are looking for. So it's extremely important to make sure you are using proper heading structure so that all users can do the easy scanning. And of course, correct and descriptive headings help boost SEO. Scannable articles equal readable articles, and readable articles are high Google performance. That's because Google likes to reward content that's user-friendly. Content that's easy to read is, by definition, more user-friendly than content that isn't. Using descriptive headings with important keywords is a great way to give the user a complete overview of the content on the page without in-depth reading. So now that we have a little bit more background of what's going on, let's talk about how to actually write accessible content with hierarchy in mind. The first thing I want to say is you want to write all your content in a text editor first. This way you are focused on the content and content only, rather than the visuals of the site and how it's going to appear on the site. This is always the recommended way to create any content you may have to ensure spelling is correct. You can even leverage AI to proofread or update your content. And you can ensure that the content is accessible and easy to read without the use of visuals. And with that, you want to make sure that you work with the outline bar open if that is an option for your text editor. This way you can visually see how it would be read to a screen reader based on structure alone. You can focus on making the outline scannable, which ensures the content itself is scannable. Working in the text editor with the outline open is a great way to make sure everything is coming together in an accessible way. So I have this example here. So this is just dummy content. There's nothing in there. It's called Doggo Ipsum if you're looking for a variation of your normal lorem ipsum, and it's filled with dog's words. There's nothing important in here. This is just for visual cue of what we're looking at. And this is using Google Docs. So I have the outline open on the left-hand column, and then in the main content is where I'm writing everything there. And in the right-hand side, you can see, if you are looking at this, you're able to see that this is using a heading 4, a heading 5, a heading 6, a heading 2. I am actually using the heading structure from the Google Doc. In the outline, it shows a very perfect view of what it actually looks like from that outline standpoint. So we can see that the heading 3 is indented under the heading 2. The H4 is even further indented. Heading 6 is all the way over. You can very easily see how the hierarchy is working within the content on the page. On this next slide, I decided to play around a little bit with how some things would appear visually if we were to change some things up. So I have a heading 2 with a following heading 4 that looks just like that heading 2. I also have some paragraphs that I bolded to look like the heading 5. So visually, it still gives some kind of hierarchy going on there. You can kind of understand that there are subsections going on. However, if we're reviewing the outline of the page, we can easily see that we go from an H2 to an H3, next section is an H2, and then we jump to an H4. So you can see that that's already pushed in further than that H3 that's above it. So it's not following that normal progression and indentation of the outline. You may also notice that the paragraphs that look like headings do not appear in that outline whatsoever. And that would be very similar to a screen reader user where those paragraphs are paragraphs, they're not headings, so they're not going to be able to jump around to those specific elements there. I really played around with this one so we could see it where we have heading 2s, heading 6, H5s, the paragraphs that look like that. And if again, there's some kind of visual cue, you would understand what you're looking at. But from a screen reader perspective and the semantic structure perspective, we can see that that flow is just like all over the place. We go from an H2 to an H6, back to an H5, even though the H5 visually looks like it would be under an H6, and so on and so on. It's kind of a very confusing experience. So we want to make sure that we're following the semantic structure, the programmatic structure before we focus on visuals. Here I have the actual outline that I use for creating this presentation. And in the outline section, we can very easily see that we're following, there's no big jumps in indentation. We're following the correct flow from H2s, 3s, 4s, and so on. So someone can easily navigate the content on the page without any worries there. And we want to make sure we match semantic hierarchy to a visual hierarchy. Put everything into your content management system after you've already put it in Word or you put it into Google Doc or whatever you use. Keep everything as the default styles for now and preview how it looks. Ideally, your designer set you up for success, and an approved visual hierarchy just works well with your content hierarchy. However, I do know that that's not always the case. A lot of times designers don't have actual content to work from when they're creating a lot of this stuff. So once we see it in real time and there's actual content in there, sometimes tweaks need to be made in order to make the visual hierarchy just work better with the content that you're using. If you are finding that some headings just seem too big, or maybe your eyes tend to look at H3s before the H2s based on color, size, or overall style, bring it up with your designers who can either tweak the default looks or maybe even give you some other styling options. Sometimes it's worth having a heading 2 and then 2 variations that you can use and change the look of it so that it matches the type of content you may be working with on that page, but it still fits within your overall design system. So for example, when I was saying you might be able to have options, one thing that I see a lot of times that is actually fairly easy to do is you can include various styles. So you can end up highlighting your heading 2 that you're using within your content, go to the styles tab, and you may have other variations of what you can do with that. So for instance, we have in this one, there's text styles, so we can do a wider spacing or small caps. This is just a default screenshot from the CK Editor website. There's nothing fancy here really, but you could have lots of options. You could have more customized ones where maybe there's an H2 that's really big and then another version that's much smaller that might work for instances where there are a lot of H2s on a page and you don't want to like make it a massive, massive page. So there's different ways that you can make that work. And if you need a developer or a designer to add this to your site, I highly recommend that. And when in doubt, if you need to just double check the content on your site, but you don't have to always just like go in there and copy, paste it, put it elsewhere and see what's going on. You can actually go to WebAIM, wave.webaim.org, I believe is the URL. I use the Chrome extension. It's a little bit easier there, but you can go to the WebAIM site and put in your URL, and then you can actually turn the styles off. You can see what the headings are and so on. So if I have this quick little video, so I have this on the Ames Community College site. I'm looking at the structure. I can see exactly what headings are being used throughout this whole page, but you can also go and turn the styles off completely. And this gives you a better idea of the overall programmatic and the semantic structure of your site. It gives you an idea of how a screen reader user, for instance, will be able to interact with your site. The overall flow from just up to down, the structures you're using. It can confirm if you're using the right headings or if it's physically in a list and doesn't just appear to be in a list because you were adding your own little bullets or something in there. It's a good way to confirm some of those things so you have an accessible heading hierarchy. And we want to talk about how we work a hierarchy in a component first approach. When I talk about heading hierarchy, this is usually one of the first questions that I'm getting because component first approach is just very common. It's what a lot of us are using nowadays to help keep things consistent, but also speed up both the development and design process. How do we prepare a correct hierarchy with this approach? This starts with talking about how these are generally used on the page, how the components are used on the page. Keep in mind, I understand that there are always outliers to every situation, but the ones that we're going to talk about today will be fairly consistent across most sites. But before we look at some examples, we need to make sure that we're all on the same page about what I'm referring to when I'm talking about a component first approach. It is a design approach of breaking up a site's design into common groupings or components that can be reused throughout the design. So think of even just like a call to action or a styled block that you can kind of place anywhere on the site and it needs to be able to work easily. Not only does this create consistency throughout the design, but it speeds up the design and development process. Working with designers who are well aware of hierarchy and component-based designs ensures that the design is consistent, interesting, and accessible. In this webinar, we'll talk about some of the ones that I get asked the most about from even my developers when people are first starting, or just other times that I've given this presentation, or when I'm doing any kind of audit or some support. So I see this a lot with headings and subheadings, sidebar blocks, and we'll go into some examples for all of them, so you'll be able to see them in real time. Call to actions, accordions, and teaser lists. Teaser lists are things that I'm referring to, like maybe staff listings, search results, event listings, and so on. It's just a smaller view of the larger page content that you might have. So let's talk about headings with subheadings. So I see this a lot where either we have this large heading on the page, and then there's usually a smaller heading that's either above or below. So the first thing we always want to do when we're talking about the headings and the subheadings is to ask ourselves how this is actually being used. So for this instance, the actual name of the page is Database Analyst, and the Division of Student Affairs is somewhat related, but Database Analyst is not reliant on that one above it. So there is no point to have a specific heading structure for it. A lot of times it's probably a link that goes to like a taxonomy page that lists everything within Division of Student Affairs. So in this instance, we actually have it as a paragraph and a heading 1. Ideally, I prefer when the labels like that are actually below the heading, because then you can give it a little bit more structure to it. However, this could just be a link or a paragraph, and it's fine. It's not imperative to have a heading structure for that element, because the most important element here is the database analyst job listing. We do see instances like this, however, where we have, in this case, it says Sanford Underground Research Facility, Neutrino Day. And I see this one a lot where this is actually one big sentence or phrase. So that Sanford Underground Research Facility is a part of the Neutrino Day. We're just emphasizing the more important aspect of it, which is Neutrino Day. That's the shorthand version of what this is called. So in an instance like this, the whole thing is wrapped in an H1, and we actually just have a span, or you would highlight in the CK editor and just style it slightly different so that it gives an appearance of some kind of hierarchy. Visually, we can see the hierarchy. We're looking at Neutrino Day. However, as an H1, we want the whole thing to be read for SEO purposes and for screen reader purposes. Next, we'll talk about sidebar blocks. And what I'm referring to here is like this page here, I have the main content on the left and the sidebar is on the right in this design. Sometimes you'll see it on the left, of course, but we can see there are blocks that are placed over here. So there's a contact info block, locations, hours, related links, and so on. And this is all I'm saying. It could be anything. It could be a basic call to action, but specifically, I tend to see these a lot in the sidebar. So I did want to call these out. And in this instance, we can see that contact info is the heading 2, locations is a heading 2, hours is a heading 2. And that's because each one of these bits of information, each one of these blocks can live on their own. They are not reliant on anything. You do not need the contact info block in order to have the locations and hours. You could just have the locations block and it can still live on its own perfectly fine. And they're all related to each other in a parallel way, but they're not reliant on each other. And that's a great way to kind of distinguish if it needs to have the H2 or if it needs to be an H3. So for instance, in the contact info box, we also have the federal school code listed here, and that is reliant on the contact info heading and therefore is an H3 and not an H2. Next are call to actions. So these are all over everybody's websites in various forms. This one itself, it looks like I already have the H3s listed there. I didn't put the animation on there, but we have a number of call to actions. There's 4 here. We have the join us to fight back with facts form, get our newsletter form, follow us on Instagram, and the global research and policy. These, again, similar to those sidebar blocks, they can all live completely on their own. There's no need, like, You don't need to have global research policy in order to have the follow us on Instagram. They're all related in a parallel way, but they are not reliant on each other. They could be found anywhere on the site and they do not need any information before it in order to exist on the page. You can see on global research and policy, we also have some heading 3s, and that's because usually when you're seeing multiple of like the same type of thing, whether it's like these the research articles or maybe like event listings or similar, we're going to go into more detail about those, but the event listings or profiles, when there's multiple of the same thing, those are probably H3s because they most likely need a heading to describe what that list is going to be. Another good example here is from the Natural History Museum of Utah, and you may think that those two call to actions are reliant on the Discover the Collections. But now that I bring up the headings on the page, we can see that the two call to actions at the bottom are separate entities of the initial block above it, that component. So each one of those, they may be visually slightly different, that the science stories and the citizen science, because they have the different color, but that's just the style to it. The overall component itself is just that one big block. The Discover the Collections is a larger component. So that little slideshow is fully reliant on the Discover the Collections text, and has the paragraph text and everything else there. And obviously everything within the Discover the Collections, all the like archaeology, botany, I'm trying to see what else is on there, mineralogy and so on. Those are all going to be heading 3s because they're the subsection of the initial component section. And we have a staff listing, which again is similar to what I was saying. Once you see like multiple of the same type of component being used, it probably needs some kind of heading to encapsulate it all and describe all of them. And that alone, like inspiring aardvarks, would be the H2, and each person's name would end up being the H3. Another big one I see pretty often is accordions. So I actually have this in a couple different ways because really there are a few different instances of why someone might be having an accordion on their page. So in this instance, in my preferred direction is to have a heading at the top, so like program questions, and then have each accordion item be an H3 button. And that way it's easier, especially for FAQ pages where you see these all the time. This seems to be a pretty common occurrence on those pages. You can group those accordions and those questions into larger chunks so that someone can easily jump around to program questions or adopting course materials. They can jump quickly to the section they're looking for and then jump to the subsection that they really truly want. It's an easy way to just break up the content on the page. So this is my preferred direction. However, sometimes it doesn't make sense to do that. Sometimes maybe you don't have a lot of accordions on your site and you don't plan on it. In this instance, like this page, we probably just need heading 2s, and that's all that it is. It didn't need any kind of like parent heading to take care of it and give more context because there weren't a lot of headings 2s to begin with. So it was easy to work with. So either one of those accordion elements is perfectly fine. It's obviously just completely dependent on the content that you have on the site. Oops. And another one that I see this with a lot is with search results. So obviously the search results, this is the heading 1 on the page. And in this instance, each search result is going to be a heading 2. There is no heading above it that's giving more context. And this is what I see a lot of times. This next instance is probably my preferred direction solely because I love getting the extra context on the page. And that's throwing it a little wrench in there where each search item is actually each search item is in H3 because the extra context is with showing 7 posts for COVID-19. I love having the heading giving a little bit more information about what is going to describe the search listing. And then, of course, there's things like latest news and upcoming events that you may have on your pages as well, where we have that main parent heading with the subheadings below it. And always remember when you're working with components and you know this component will be used in multiple instances, it is always best to just default to an H2 and work within the heading structure of your component from there. I would rather you create more chapters in a book than a mismatch of confusing chapters versus subchapters versus none of this related, and now everybody is absolutely confused. I would rather you have too many H2s than to skip these headings altogether, since skipping these headings can be more detrimental and overall confusing to the user. So let's just do one final recap. So remember that programmatic hierarchy should always come before a visual hierarchy. We never want to change a heading level to match a visual style. If you want it visually to change because it's too big or anything like that, that should be done with CSS and not by changing the heading level. We never want to use bolded paragraphs as headings. We never want to skip heading levels. H5 and H6 are rarely used. If you are using these a lot within your website, you most likely are skipping heading levels altogether. So it's definitely worth taking a look and double checking your content to ensure you're following the correct heading hierarchy. And of course, when in doubt, use a heading too. Default, worst comes to worst, like I said, I'd rather you have too many chapters than no chapters at all. And of course, if you find yourself still confused or asking what your next steps are, remember that Aten is here to help. We believe in giving back to the community, like doing informative webinars like the one I'm doing today, as well as free consultations, which you can sign up for by going to aten.io/accessibility. And if you are interested in resources, feel free to use this QR code to gain access. I actually don't even remember what this link is, but let me take a picture and then that way I can put it into the chat for everybody, in case that's the direction you're really looking for. You're dropping it over here. But this has a list of a ton of different resources so that you can end up seeing maybe blogs and webinars. Let's get a whole bunch of things going on here. Blogs, webinars, documents, site auditing and compliance, and a bunch of other just resources and just recommendations for what you should be doing to create more accessible content. And I am already out of my presentation mode here. So just remember, if you have any questions at all, feel free to reach out to Michaela at aten.io, and I'm always happy to answer some questions. And as mentioned, I do have a good chunk of time left, which is what I was hoping for, in case you all have any questions or have questions on your own site or anything like that that you would like to go over so that we can clear up anything. So hopefully y'all learned something today, and I'll stop sharing my screen and we can see what everybody has, if there's any questions that you may have for me. Thanks.
Yeah, I didn't see any questions left in the chat. Okay, last call. Does anybody else have any questions?
Hi, I don't have a question for Michaela, but I had a question. You guys are recording this. Are you guys going to share this with us, or because I like to share this video with one of my staff members?
Absolutely. We're actually live streaming now to YouTube. So
Okay, perfect. So we can just find it.
yeah, so if you go to the Drupal for Gov YouTube channel, you should be able to see this video.
Thank you.
I see a question from Chris. Is it okay to use H2 above an H1?
That is a good question. Yeah, I've seen that pretty often. I would say it is to a point because I understand where you're referring to. So like just global elements that like wrap the whole page. If you can avoid it, it's always better to avoid it, but sometimes it just makes sense to have those global elements as H2s. It also may be worth looking into correct semantic structure there by using an ARIA label on your nav element, which then you don't have to worry about having a visually hidden heading to or anything like that. And it gives the correct structure that you may need for SEO purposes as well as screen readers. So it's definitely interesting to maybe go on that approach as well, but I will say, if you can avoid H2 above an H1, I would highly recommend it. However, I do understand that global element, and most people do understand that global element as well. I think that was all I saw come in the chat myself.
Okay. Well, again, thank you, Michaela, for giving such a informative presentation, especially when it comes to accessibility. I know I think about it when beginning to architect the website, but it's also important to deal with it as you're creating content in other template pages. So thank you so much.
Of course.
All right, everybody. Also to our audience, thank you for attending, and I hope to see you next month. Bye. Take care, everybody. Stay safe.